and girls, settle down, stop throwing paper darts. Thank you for joining me today, where people continue to be wrong on the interwebs. They continue to be recidivist offenders. They continue to be salad boy who wants to push a dangerous contraindicated diet, including the pouring of hundreds of grams of unnecessary and, in fact, contraindicated carbohydrates down one's ridiculous neck every single day of one's life. And he wants to claim that there are no hidden dangers in so doing. Okay, Paul. Righto. Anyway, let's deal with Paul's argument on its own merits, or lack thereof, that he's made recently in a video, responding, it seems, to a video put together by Dr. Ken Berry with some help from myself, including finding out some very interesting facts around hemoglobin A1c testing, etc., and its relative insensitivity to fructose and galactose, and suggesting that that might be a reason to be relatively concerned about the intake of particularly large amounts of fructose, which you'll find in fruit and honey, don't you, Paul? Anyway, Paul wants to continue to justify his addiction to carbohydrates, and he wants to push his ideas as being safe and effective for others, despite them not having the situation that he has in terms of his activity levels, etc. So anyway, let's deal with Paul and see what he has to say and put him right where he's wrong. And boys and girls, just a spoiler, that's everywhere. Off you go, Paul.
There's been a bit of discussion recently online about potential hidden dangers of fruit and honey.
Yes, so I received a message a couple of weeks ago from Dr. Ken Berry saying, listen, can you look into the potential insensitivity of the hemoglobin A1c test to picking up fructose and galactose? Is it quite specific for glucose-mediated glycation of the red cells? I did a bit of research, found out that yes, it is very sensitive, and it doesn't pick up fructose or galactose as well as it picks up glucose remotely. And as such, you might be consuming a diet with a relatively high amount of fructose in it, Paul, for example, and your A1c would come back within the normal range, but that would not be able to detect, perhaps, the damage to your body being done by the fructose at large, Paul. Anyway, let's talk more about the actual science. This is where it gets fun.
I saw a few comments on YouTube, and I wanted to do a video in response to this. As many of you know, I'm a huge advocate for including fruit and honey in the human diet.
And that's why you should remain silent about diet for human beings, Paul, for all time, because the exact amount of required carbohydrates in human beings is not 1 single gram ever, and about the worst possible exogenous carbohydrate you can pour down your neck is fructose. We'll get to that a bit later, though.
And
basically, criminal misanthropy from you, Paul. Trying to justify an addiction to a contraindicated substance is all you're doing here. It's disgraceful. It's not becoming of a physician, Paul, at all. Okay? Stop it.
And in this video, I'm going to show you why hemoglobin A1c does actually measure fructose glycations.
You're not going to show any such thing at all. In fact, Paul, just a spoiler for the boys and girls, he's about to attempt to show that, and he's going to fall flat on his stupid face again, because Paul Saladino is not trained in science, does not know how to read a science paper, and cannot critically assess what he's reading. And he's going to make just about every schoolboy error in the book on looking at a couple of papers here, and we'll get to that in a minute when I stop talking so much. Off you go, Paul.
So that you would know if you had any problems with excess fructose in your body. Number two, I'm going to show you that fruit has repeatedly been shown to be healthy in the human diet.
No such studies exist, Paul. Healthy is a hard outcome. Health is the absence of disease process. There are no studies under control long-term that can inform on any aspect of diet whatsoever and hard health outcomes in human beings over any period of time. So you're not going to show that either. So if that's the two goals of your video, then you fail before you even start. But let's get to your failure on the number one. It actually, we're 30 seconds in, and I think it's not until about a third of the way through that he actually starts talking about the science paper. So I'll stop talking quite so much. I really will.
And number three, I'm going to show you some hidden dangers of a ketogenic diet.
No, you're not. You're not going to do that either.
That are not being talked about, that are connected with this whole conversation, that I think will bring much of this into focus.
No, Paul, what you're doing is throwing smoke and mirrors. You're throwing cloud up. You're throwing mud in the water. You're confusing people who do not have the intelligence or the experience of science, or both, to actually critically assess what you're saying here. They like what you're saying because they want good news about their bad habits in terms of sugar, and they will gravitate to you because you're telling them it's okay to poison themselves with sugar. It's not okay, Paul. It's disgraceful, and you need to stop it today.
So let's start with the overarching framework of this conversation. Fructose is a sugar. It's present in foods like fruit and honey. Now, those foods also...
They are not foods, Paul. Fruit and honey are not foods for human beings.
...contain sugars like glucose. And if you're drinking milk, you're going to get a sugar called galactose as part of the disaccharide lactose. So the three main sugars that humans come in contact with in our daily lives are glucose, galactose, and fructose, with, as I mentioned, honey and fruit being the primary dietary sources of fructose. Now, within the ketogenic community, there are many people who fear fructose.
Fear? No. There are many people who understand why fructose is so hugely contraindicated, and we'll get to that a bit later on. You are telling people to basically pour poison down their necks in huge quantities every single day, Paul.
I've done multiple podcasts on this and had multiple conversations with people on the other side of this issue on my podcast, in which I've presented a significant amount of evidence.
No, you haven't, Paul. You've made errors of interpretation, schoolboy errors of interpretation of papers, time and time again, including in this video here.
That fructose in food form is not harmful for humans.
There are no studies that show any such thing, Paul.
Whenever we're talking about fructose in the human diet, we have to be careful that we don't conflate studies that are administering pure fructose or high fructose corn syrup to humans or animals with studies looking at whole food sources of fructose. Those are things like honey and fruit.
No, they're not food for humans still.
The latter set of studies diverges significantly from the former set of studies, probably because things like processed sugars, including high fructose corn syrup, contain cornstarch that is not accounted for in the calories on the label.
Okay, so there's a lot of assumptions there, none of which are actually supported by science.
Adding extra calories to these foods.
No, calories are heat, Paul.
And potentially crossing the gut lining, leading to inflammation when these undigested starches get into the blood.
That's the great thing about the word potentially, isn't it, Paul? Because it leaves the other thing entirely on the table. Potentially not as well.
So I think most people would agree, high fructose corn syrup, harmful for humans.
Yes. Most people would agree that have any sense. Also, those that have sense understand that the same is true of fructose in fruit or honey as well. And they see that the absolute magnitude of the damage seems to be less, however, not absent. Okay? Pretty straightforward. Yes, honey and fruit less damaging immediately than high fructose corn syrup, but not damaging. We'll get to that.
Seen that in human trials. Many trials in rodent studies will use pure fructose.
Rodent studies are not applicable to human beings. We have different enzyme systems. We have slightly different DNA. We have different ecological niches in terms of our required diet. We have evolved along different lines. Rodent studies are not particularly useful. They can be at the level of some basic blood chemistry things like, for example, the A1c responses and things potentially.
This is harmful to rodents. That's very clear in rodent studies because rodents would never eat pure fructose and humans would never eat pure.
But Paul's also going to cite a study which he purports to be in favor of his argument, which also shows that fructose is damaging to rodents. But he brushes over that.
Pure fructose either. Often these sugars are given to rodents as part of what have been called crap in a bag diets that also include seed oils and grains and other refined ingredients. So when we're looking at rodent studies, if we find that fructose is harmful in rodents, we should not be surprised. But if you look at human feeding studies of whole food forms of fructose, and I will show you some of these later in this podcast, or observational studies looking at fruit consumption, what you find is that fruit and honey are beneficial for humans.
No, you find no such thing, Paul. That is a completely incompetent reading of the literature. There are no studies whatsoever in existence anywhere in the literature that support that ridiculous claim.
There's really no interventional, randomized controlled trial evidence that fruit and honey are harmful for humans.
Right, that doesn't mean that there is evidence that they are not. There is no controlled interventional studies available one way or the other, Paul. That's a completely different message. Okay, what you've just done is you have spun propaganda-wise the facts to suit your ideology being it's perfectly okay to pour poison down your neck. It's disgraceful behavior, Paul. It's incompetent in the highest order. It's dishonest at the very least. It's time for you to shut down your channel, Paul, and stop with this nonsense. Really, it's long past time you stop.
So with this in mind, I think that some folks go looking for mechanistic reasons that are unsupported by science to say that fruit and honey are harmful.
Right. Well, there is no reason on that criteria to suggest that they are not either, Paul. We have to look at mechanistic speculation to say what is likely to be damaging long-term for human beings, potentially, because we don't have the studies. That's the whole point. So we look at sensible mechanistic understandings and inferences, and we do that by looking at the data in a competent fashion, which is where you fall on your face, Paul, because you're not competent to read science remotely.
Current misconception noted within the health sphere is that fructose glycation of hemoglobin is not measured by any lab tests that we have commercially.
No, it's not that it's not measured, Paul. It's that the test is highly insensitive to glycation caused by fructose or galactose. It is highly specific for glucose glycation of red blood cells, and as such, it does not pick up the glycative damage from fructose or galactose remotely as well. And the study you're about to put forward, so-called in support of your argument, actually says exactly that again as well. Doesn't it, Paul? Did you read the thing at all? We'll get to it in a minute, boys and girls. I promise we will.
Available for humans. This is wrong. And I will show you evidence for this.
No, you won't, Paul. You'll fall flat on your face.
Very clearly in one moment.
No, you won't. Sorry.
Both the hemoglobin A1c assay and the fructosamine assay, which is measuring sugars, either glucose, galactose, or fructose, bound to an albumin molecule, while the hemoglobin A1c test measures those sugars bound to a hemoglobin molecule.
But it's very, very specific for glucose, as I've said.
Both of those tests do rise when excess amounts of fructose are consumed.
Yes, but not commensurate to the amount of fructose present.
So with that stated, it's important to understand that if in fact eating fruit and honey was very bad for you, we would see a rise in your hemoglobin A1c to...
And we do to some degree, despite the fact that the A1c assay is largely insensitive to it. Nonetheless, we still see it, which shows that the damage is likely much worse than you think it is, Paul. That's the whole argument. The fact that you are either unable to understand that or choose to spin that, direct the attention somewhere else. Oh, look, shiny thing over there, and tell your people that this is not a real problem. This is the most irresponsible video I have ever seen you make, Paul. This is beyond disgraceful. Wakey, wakey, smell the bakey, son.
To pathological levels. Generally, a level of 5.6 on a hemoglobin A1c is what's accepted to be normal, and below that and above that is expected to be pathological.
Oh, right. So exactly, it becomes toxic at a level where your hemoglobin is glycated to 5.6. Perfectly safe below 5.6 or at 5.6, but 5.60001, suddenly that's pathological, is it, Paul? Good, son. Good. Wow.
Hemoglobin A1c is a proxy for the average blood sugar, but as I stated, it is clear from
the average blood glucose is what it's a proxy for. Remember, Paul? Glucose.
Experimental studies in mammals that when you feed mammals, which have the exact same blood chemistry as us.
No, they don't, Paul. That's false as well.
You're going to have the exact same chemical reactions happening.
No, that's an assumption based on a false assumption. That's still false, Paul.
In their blood, when a sugar molecule attaches to a hemoglobin as us, when you feed mammals excess fructose, you see a rise in both hemoglobin A1c and fructose.
Yes, but not commensurate with the intake of such sugars.
So there are no hidden dangers here.
Yes, there are. The danger is still the same, Paul. It's that the A1c test is not sensitive to fructose or galactose. Okay? Still.
If there is a danger to fructose in whole food form, fruit and honey, which is what's being discussed here.
That's not food still.
We would see it in the hemoglobin A1c. And we do.
No, you don't, because the A1c is not sensitive to it, Paul. That's the whole point.
Not see that. So let me show you a study done in rats. These are mammals. Again, the chemistry by which this sugar molecule is going to glycate their albumin and their hemoglobin is entirely equivalent to ours.
No, it's not. It's just very similar.
And as I mentioned earlier, fructose in rats is not a good thing. So we know that the outcome of this trial is bad because giving these rats fructose leads to excess oxidative stress. As I mentioned earlier,
define oxidative stress, Paul.
The same is not seen when we feed rats honey, and in humans, we do not see the same effects with fruit or honey in whole food form, and I'll show you those later. So
yeah, but none of those things are experimental cause and effect studies that can actually inform on the question at hand, Paul. It's just yet more smoke and mirrors. It's more propaganda. It's more justification for your addiction to a poisonous, contraindicated substance in your diet.
Let me show you a study in mammals that clearly shows.
No, it doesn't.
That there is no hidden danger.
It shows no such thing, Paul. Not at all.
Fructose, because you will see all of the glycation reflected in the hemoglobin A1c. And
false. The study that you're about to show, Paul, does not show that whatsoever.
The fructosamine assay. So here's the study that I want to note. The title is Long-Term Fructose Consumption Accelerates Glycation and Several Age-Related Variables in Male Rats. As I said, feeding rats pure fructose is really bad. But the point of me showing you this is to prove that if the levels of fructose in your blood go up with consumption, you will see this reflected in your hemoglobin A1c and your fructosamine. The chemistry.
Except the study doesn't show that, Paul. But we'll get to that.
Happening in these rats' blood is exactly the same as ours.
You've said that already. It was false the first time and it's still false.
These are chemistry reactions by which a sugar is attaching to a protein. It's exactly like ours.
No, it's not. It's just very, very similar.
So if you look here in table 1 for this paper, you will see these rats, they are fed 250 grams per liter solutions of fructose, glucose, or sucrose for 1 year.
Great. And how much of each of the different solutions in the 4 different subgroups here did each of those rats consume? What control was exerted over how much sugar, syrup, or water each rat drank during that year? None at all, Paul Saladino. No control was exerted over that. It was ad libitum. Whoops. We should be done with the study at that stage already. There we go. Major error. But you're not done with it, Paul, so we'll hear what you've got to say and then we'll put it right.
And you can see here is the water-fed group, the glucose-fed group, the sucrose-fed group. So that's a disaccharide of glucose and fructose. and the fructose-fed group. Notably, the blood glucose levels for all of the intervention arms of this trial, glucose, sucrose, and fructose, are all pretty similar, which is going to be important when we're looking at the hemoglobin A1c level and the fructosamine level. You can see the blood fructose levels here. Not surprisingly, the glucose-fed group has a low level of blood fructose. The sucrose-fed group has a slightly higher level, not 100x or anything like that. And the fructose.
So since when is 0.48 higher than 0.50, Paul? When I went to school, 0.48 was below 0.50.
Fed group, pure fructose fed group, has a higher level of fructose in their blood.
Goodness me. Really? Higher levels of fructose in the blood when the rats allowed ad libitum to drink a solution containing fructose. What a shock. What's your point?
If you look at...
We'll look at the actual statistics in a minute, by the way.
The fructosamine assay, you see very clearly that the fructose-fed group sees a rise in the fructosamine assay.
False, Paul. Incompetent assessment of the statistics provided to you in this table. False. We'll get to that in a minute.
Similarly to the hemoglobin A1c. So this column right here.
Again, false. Not correct, Paul.
Is the blood glycated hemoglobin clearly showing?
No, Paul. Wrong. Again.
That when you feed mammals high levels of fructose and you get high levels of fructose in the blood, you get an increase in the hemoglobin A1c.
Right. Well, let's have a look at these statistics, shall we? And put this argument to bed. Here is the paper concerned. Let's look at the table that Paul was just talking about there, just for fun, shall we, boys and girls? All right. What Paul indicated was that the fructose level in the blood was clearly elevated versus the glucose situation, shall we say. All right. What we're looking at here is it says 2.63 plus or minus 0.15. Now, what does that plus or minus mean? That plus or minus gives us an indication of the variability of the individual rats concerned in this study. N equals 10, by the way, in each group, 10. And it shows the variability of each of the individual responses of each of those 10 rats as a guide to the noise around the signal, the mean value for all 10 rats in that group, or each of those two groups, if you like. All right. The figures given are plus or minus the standard deviation. Okay, so what you get is the ability to say, right, how far around that mean value do these data points spread? Okay, and for 95% of the data points, you need to take 1.96 standard deviations either side of the mean value. And then if you want to assert that two group means are meaningfully clinically different from one another, you would need to take that 1.96, call it 2 if you want to, and multiply that by 2 to get 4 standard deviations of difference to say, yeah, these are clearly very, very different results. So shall we do that for fun? All right. So we have 2.63 plus or minus 0.3, which would give us 2.33 would be the lower bound of 95% confidence on the fructose. 2.33. The one that's been compared to is the 1.48, plus or minus 0.24, 1.6, 1.72. So there is a separation there, and that's no surprise, given that the glucose group are not being fed fructose, and they're not being allowed to drink fructose ad libitum, and the fructose group are being allowed to do that. So fine. No surprises there. Okay. The fructosamine assay that measures the glycation of the albumin suggests to us that we have 0.24 plus or minus 0.18, which would give us 1.06 lower bound, versus glucose 0.93 plus or minus 0.12, 1.15, isn't it? Whoopsie daisy. Signal to noise ratio. Okay. Now, the reason I'm talking about that 4 standard deviations, by the way, is for 90 or power of 0.95, which, you really need power of about 0.95 with a sample size as small as n equals 10 to be remotely taken seriously by a decent scientist. So that's why I'm using those numbers, in case anyone was confused as to why. That's why. All right, so the fructosamine signal to noise ratio suggests actually that while the fructose group did have a higher glucose level in their plasma, there was not necessarily a meaningful difference in the glycation of albumin. Isn't that interesting? So there goes that argument a bit. Now, if we look at the blood hemoglobin level, we have 3.27 plus or minus 0.47. So we have 2.6 at the lower bound. And if we look at the glucose, we have 2.59 plus or minus 0.4 something. Signal to noise ratio, we do not see either increased glycation of the albumin meaningfully in a clinical sense in the fructose group, neither do we see a meaningful change in the hemoglobin A1c reading. Exactly what we would expect to not see, precisely because of the insensitivity that we're talking about. Whoopsie daisy, Paul, you've interpreted that completely wrong because you're incompetent to read science. You've read a paper that says, look, there's a statistical difference here, and you've taken that to mean that it's clinically meaningful or useful in any way. You've also made the mistake of assuming that rats are humans and humans are rats. They're not, Paul. Okay? So we're done with that bit. This study does not show what you're suggesting that it shows, not remotely, not at all. Sorry about that. Okay, let's get back to what you're saying about stuff and things, though, shall we?
There is no hidden danger to fructose. I'm not saying.
Yeah, there still is. So let's just pop back to that paper again for a moment. I know we've just spent some time there, but let's go back there because that comment was just so incredible, by which I mean lacking in credibility, Paul, of any kind. Right. Let's go to the conclusions and the discussion statement of these authors that you're putting forward this paper as proof of something that it's not proof of, clinically or meaningfully in any way, actually. This study is actually mostly about the effect of the fructose on proteins of the body, collagen and things like that, Paul, and it does actually show something very interesting, which seems to be borne out, perhaps in other examples, but we'll get to that. All right, discussion. The purpose of the study was to investigate the consequences of long-term fructose consumption compared with glucose or sucrose on glycation, lipid peroxidation, and aging. Good. We measured the levels of fructosamine and HbA1c as indices of glycation, urine malonaldehyde levels as an indication of lipid peroxidation, and collagen solubility, cross-linking, and fluorescence as age-related parameters. Okay, fine. Because previous in vitro studies clearly showed that fructose is a more potent glycating agent than glucose, okay, and is as much as 10-fold more efficient at forming AGE, we hypothesized that chronic fructose intake may adversely affect aging in vivo in rats. Fructose consumption increased blood fructosamine and GHB, A1c that means statistically, Paul, but not meaningfully, as I've just discussed. Urine lipid peroxidation excretion, skin collagen cross-linking, collagen-bound fluorescence in cortical bones, and decreased skin collagen solubility. Thus, we suggest that fructose, compared with glucose or sucrose, accelerates the normal aging process, Paul. Perhaps. All right. Glycated hemoglobin and fructosamine are amidori products, the first stable sugar protein glycated adducts formed by glucose, and in practice their determination is now accepted and used as a means of monitoring the long-term control of blood glucose. Unlike glycated hemoglobin, which reflects the average blood glucose levels over the past 60 days, the measurement of glycated albumin or glycated proteins, commonly referred to as the fructosamine assay, reflects the average blood glucose concentration over the past 20 days. Fine. Both variables were elevated in rats fed fructose, table 1, statistically, is what that means, and may, is that word? May indicate higher circulating glucose in these rats. See how they said that? The elevated A1c may indicate elevated glucose. It actually doesn't, because the signal-to-noise ratio means that it doesn't show any such thing, but there you go. All right? Although no differences in fasting blood glucose levels were observed, our data suggest that higher postprandial blood glucose levels in fructose-fed rats cannot be ruled out. Furthermore, higher glycated hemoglobin and fructosamine levels failed to reflect the 77% increase in fasting blood fructose levels. These data indicate that neither assay can accurately detect in vivo fructation, Paul. These assays were developed for the detection of glucose amidori products, ketones, of hemoglobin and albumin, whereas fructose amidori products are aldehydes and would be expected to react differently. Paul, there it is in black and white from these scientists who actually understand the assays, unlike you. So you've misrepresented the statistics in this paper completely, incompetently, in a disgraceful and misanthropic fashion to suit your ideology and your addiction to sugar. And you've ignored, or not even read this paper, where these authors explain to you in clear, unambiguous terms that both the assays involved here are specific for glucose glycation. Wow. There it is. Okay, anyway, back to Paul and what he was saying about stuff and things.
Saying that feeding humans or rats pure fructose is good, what I am proving to you with this study is
that you are totally and utterly incapable of remotely, rationally, sensibly, or competently analyzing literature, Paul, and you should stop trying to do so because you are not competent. You've just made a fool of yourself.
in mammals, if the blood levels of fructose rise in a significant fashion, you will see this reflected.
Only we didn't. These authors did not see that, Paul. Signal to noise ratio. And they've explained why it is that they didn't see it. They even said these assay results failed to reflect the 77% change in the level of fructose in the blood. They were insensitive to it. And you've missed that somehow. Wow.
In both the fructosamine and the hemoglobin A1c.
Yeah, no.
Notably, the sucrose-fed group did not really see any increase in their hemoglobin A1c above the glucose-fed group.
Why would they? And none of the groups were particularly different.
But again, both fructosamine, which is sugars attached to albumin, and the hemoglobin A1c increased significantly.
Statistically, but not meaningfully clinically. No signal to noise ratio, sensitivity exists, no power exists, small sample size, statistical significance based on 50% power. No good, Paul.
In the purely fructose-fed rats. So just to be 100% crystal clear about
I think I have been.
this one more time, if you are eating fruit and honey
Yes.
and you are worried,
Yes.
just check a hemoglobin A1c.
No, Paul. It will not pick it up. Still.
I've checked my hemoglobin A1c.
And it won't show up, Paul, for the reasons we've spoken about. And for the reasons that the authors of that paper that you've just touted as evidence for your argument also stated unequivocally, Paul.
I've shared it multiple times on my blood work. It's within normal.
So what? Normal doesn't mean optimal.
My hemoglobin A1c is not elevated to excess because...
What's excess? 5.600001, Paul? And given that that is totally insensitive probably to your fructose damage, which might appear patent to some viewers, maybe there is a hidden danger that you don't appreciate or that you don't want to appreciate because your ideology doesn't allow it, Paul.
Eating fruit and honey is not harmful for humans.
There is no evidence that that is so. None at all, anywhere.
And doesn't seem to physiologically cause excess levels of glycation in us.
Because we use an assay that can't detect it, Paul, still.
If you're looking for some substantiation of that statement, I would direct your attention to this meta-analysis, which shows that total fructose-containing sugars had no harmful effect on any outcome in substitution or subtraction studies, with a decrease seen in hemoglobin A1c.
Yeah, which is insensitive still to fructose and galactose, Paul. So you still haven't proved a damn thing, except your incompetence.
In substitution studies. Furthermore, there was an interaction by food source, with specific food sources showing beneficial effects.
What's beneficial effects, Paul? What beneficial effects? That's just words on a page. Words. What beneficial effects, Paul?
Fruit and fruit juice, or harmful effects, sweetened milk, and
what are harmful effects, Paul? Just words on a page again.
Mixed sources. In the conclusions here, you can see, although most food sources of these sugars, especially fruit, do not have a harmful effect in energy match substitution.
Over how long? Controlled intervention studies of at least 7 whole days, Paul. 7 days. Are we done? This is beyond a joke, isn't it, kids? This would be funny if it wasn't so dangerous from Paul Saladino. So contraindicated and so dangerous. Absolutely disgraceful.
With other macronutrients, several food sources of fructose-containing sugars, especially sugar-sweetened beverages containing high fructose corn syrup, adding excess energy to diets have harmful effects. No surprise there.
What are harmful effects?
But in everything that I've done, I've always differentiated my recommendations that you consume fruit and...
What qualifies you to make recommendations regarding diet, Paul, to anybody? What are your credentials as a nutritionist? None at all. What are your credentials as a competent analyst on scientific papers? Well, we've just seen another clear example of it, Paul. Another patent example of it.
Honey from you consuming high fructose corn syrup or processed sugars. Furthermore, let me show you these quick studies substantiating the fact that fruit can be very beneficial for humans.
No, there are no studies that substantiate any facts about beneficial nature of any food substance of any kind over any period in terms of heart health outcomes in human beings, Paul. Still, doesn't matter what study you're about to bring up, the claim you have just made is not substantiated anywhere in the literature. So false before you even bring up the study. Go on though.
Humans, we have two studies here. The first one showing that a 7-day consumption of red oil.
Right, well, we're done then, aren't we? 7 days. Doesn't matter what they're consuming and what the outcome variables were in the study. 7 days, Paul. What was the sample size, just for fun? 19. Okay, we're done. Right, what's next?
Orange juice ameliorates endothelial function. That means it improves it and reduces inflammation in non-diabetic subjects.
That was associated with, were these people locked in a lab? Controlled remotely adequately or observed remotely adequately? No. We're done.
With increased cardiovascular risk. That doesn't sound like fructose is
risk. There you go with the word risk. No, wrong, Paul.
Doing something bad, does it? And
that's reductionist. Just because they didn't find a particular problem over a short study of 7 days duration in 19 participants under no observation and no adequate control, that doesn't mean that it's not doing something negative, Paul. Glycative damage to your body happens over a longer period of time. Quite rapidly in some individuals, it seems.
And yet another one here. This study shows that the intake of a single portion of blood orange juice provided early protection of mononuclear blood cells from oxidative DNA damage.
Right, so a single dose having some effect on an immune response, basically, probably due to largely antioxidant effect, which you could gain in other ways and should gain in other ways because fructose is still just as potentially problematic and damaging, Paul.
And they go on to note that the protective effects were not explained by vitamin C because they had a...
They said not explained by vitamin C alone. That's quite a different message, Paul. Stop with the propaganda.
Parallel arm in which vitamin C was given, thus other phytochemicals could be involved. So what they're saying is that giving blood orange juice improves endothelial function.
No. Certain markers of endothelial function in extremely short-term studies with extremely small numbers of participants under completely inadequate control and observation. That's what they say.
It improves oxidative stress markers. It provided...
What's oxidative stress, Paul? Still. We're still waiting for a definition of that. Nothing wrong with fructose in the diet at all, is there, boys and girls? Nothing at all. Nothing to see here.
Protection from oxidative stress from mononuclear blood cells, and that wasn't explained exclusively by vitamin C.
Yeah, just repeating the same falsehood again, Paul, doesn't make it any more true. It's still false.
There's a lot of evidence that fruit and honey are beneficial for humans.
No, there isn't. Paul, none at all. False.
Humans. And if you were worried about this, you would see it on your hemoglobin A1c.
No, because the A1c cannot see it, Paul, still.
As I showed you in the rat study.
No, you didn't, Paul. Not at all. You fell flat on your face, you made a fool of yourself, and you completely incompetently bungled your assessment of what those numbers even said.
Let's get to something really important that we must talk about in this video. What we're talking about here are advanced glycation end products. And the assertion by the ketogenic community was that fructose increased advanced glycation end products like...
Because it does. It's been shown independently in humans as well as in rodents and other animal models repeatedly, reliably over a number of different studies. It's a mechanistic, speculative aspect of the concept of aging at large and the breakdown of the body over time at large, but nonetheless it is there, Paul. That's why people are saying that fructose is damaging, is because it is. In the same way that glucose is damaging. More so, tenfold, as it turns out.
Hemoglobin A1c in a way that we wouldn't see them. I've shown you very clearly that is not true.
No, you haven't, Paul. False. Absolutely false. Completely false. I think we've been really clear on that.
And what the ketogenic community is not talking about here is the fact that ketogenic diets themselves cause advanced glycation end products to increase. And not just any advanced glycation end product, an advanced glycation end product called methylglyoxal, which is clearly known to be harmful to humans. Allow me to substantiate these claims.
No, it's not, though, Paul. It's a mechanistic speculation in the same way as all the other mechanistic speculations around glycation and AGEs and stuff on body function and the responses of the body to such so-called stresses or stressors.
The title of this study really says it all. Ketosis leads to increased methylglyoxal production on the Atkins diet.
Yes, ketosis. But the goal of a ketogenic diet should never be to be in ketosis or to be in ketosis long term. That's a falsehood. That's a fallacy. That's a mistake. That's something being pushed by people who do not understand human physiology. A certain amount of methylglyoxal production is probably hormetic, Paul. And the body does have systems to respond to that hormesis in such a way as to promote other processes in the body which are potentially beneficial.
You see here that even people who didn't get into ketosis on the Atkins diet increase methylglyoxal.
Again, we're talking about statistically, aren't we, Paul?
At a level of 1.67-fold.
Okay, we'll give us some raw outcome statistics so that we can look at the standard deviations around those means and see whether the signal-to-noise ratio means that that's a meaningful finding at all. See how you're not doing that at all? This abstract doesn't do it, and as such, it's a very poor abstract. However, you haven't looked into this paper to see, have you, Paul? And you wouldn't know how to if you wanted to, would you? Okay.
And they go on to say that samples from subjects with ketosis showed even greater increases in methylglyoxal.
Right. But still, we have no idea of the actual magnitude of it because the statistics are not provided for us here in this abstract. We would have to read this paper to find out. I couldn't be bothered, frankly. Neither could you, Paul, so you can't take the moral high ground there.
Well,
and actually, you wouldn't have known how to if you wanted to, as I said.
2.12-fold. That's probably not a good thing.
Yeah, but that's just a complete speculation, Paul. That is a complete speculation on your part because you have not provided the statistics so that we can look at them in such a way as to critically analyze whether that statement is likely to be correct or otherwise.
If you had any doubts about methylglyoxal, consider these papers. The title of this paper is also quite revealing. Methylglyoxal promotes oxidative stress.
You still haven't defined that, Paul. What's that?
And endothelial dysfunction.
What's that? How is that defined?
That's not good. The conclusion of this study, which is done in rat.
How do you know, Paul? Because you don't know how they've identified either of those things just from the title. You said the title was informative or telling or whatever the hell it was you just said. It's not. It's just words.
Is that the present study provides further
The substance of a paper is in the paper, not in the title of the paper. Okay?
evidence for methylglyoxal as one of the causative factors.
Well, there's a problem. As soon as you start using the word causative, credibility gone. Sorry. Is this an experiment on human beings locked in labs for decades under control and observation, Paul? No? Okay, well, we're done then. It's nothing to do with causality.
In the pathogenesis of atherosclerosis.
No, that's a mechanistic speculation, Paul.
And the development of macrovascular diabetic complication.
Yeah, speculation. May or may not have some validity. I don't know. I haven't read this paper. Couldn't be bothered to read this one either.
And then I'll show you one more study here. Title of this one, Oxidative Stress and Aging. Is methylglyoxal the hidden enemy?
We still haven't got anything out of that title because oxidative stress still needs to be defined operationally.
So we've basically gone from hidden dangers of fruit and honey,
which are still there, the insensitivity of the A1c test and the albumin assay to fructose and to galactose, its specificity for its primary vastly increased sensitivity to glucose, Paul, yes?
which don't exist, to
They still do, Paul. They still do, son.
hidden dangers of a ketogenic diet.
No, you haven't established any dangers. You've given us a bunch of mechanistic speculation without providing any actual empirical statistics that we can get our teeth into to actually analyze whether or not this is likely to be a problem or otherwise. And you've inappropriately used words like causality because you do not understand science, Paul.
If you're concerned about advanced glycation end products gumming up your physiology, and we know that methylglyoxal increases on a ketogenic diet, and that methylglyoxal has clearly been shown.
We don't know that though, Paul. You haven't provided us the statistics that we can analyze to establish whether that is so or not so meaningfully.
To create oxidative stress.
What is that?
This may be a hidden enemy if you are.
That's right. See, there's that word may again. The one that leaves the other thing entirely on the table. Maybe not too.
Restricting things like fruit and honey and not getting carbohydrates. You can see here in this paper, the authors clearly state an excess of methylglyoxal formation can increase ROS, reactive oxygen species production.
Well, that's not necessarily a bad thing. That can be hormetic too, Paul.
And cause
It acts as a signaling mechanism in the human body as well. It lets your body know what the energetic state is and what it needs to do to respond to that. It's part of the integrated functioning of a human system.
oxidative stress.
What is that? Still,
Methylglyoxal reacts with proteins, DNA, and other biomolecules, and is a major precursor of advanced glycation end products.
unless the body deals with it and clears those things out by other mechanisms, which it often does, all other things being equal.
I don't believe there are any hidden dangers of fruit and honey. And
That's a theological belief, Paul, and it's based on your desperate desire for it to be true, despite all the evidence that it is not true.
showed you that in mammals, if the levels of fructose in your blood rise to any significant degree, your levels of both fructosamine and hemoglobin A1c will reflect that.
Except you haven't shown that, Paul. Still, you have inappropriately, erroneously looked at a data set that you do not understand how to analyze, and you've analyzed it completely incompetently to suit your ideology. And you've ignored a clear statement to the contrary of what you've just said by the authors of that very paper. Wow. Dunning-Kruger much?
In my labs, in the labs of everyone I've worked with, I've never seen that happen. And there's really no documentation in the literature of that happening at all.
Of what happening?
In fact, the meta-analysis I showed you suggests that in studies of substitution and subtraction with fructose-containing foods, hemoglobin A1c often drops.
That's because of its insensitivity to fructose, you buffhead. Goodness me. Goodness me. Wow.
Then I showed you a few studies corroborating the notion that fruit can be beneficial for
No,
humans.
you didn't at all, Paul. None of those studies talk about hard health outcomes in human beings over any period of time whatsoever, or in any decent numbers, under any kind of control or observation. You showed us a bunch of ideology. You showed us some propaganda, Paul.
Humans, both protecting from oxidative stress and
What is that? Still.
improving endothelial function, which is going
What is that? Still.
to improve markers of vascular health and cardiovascular disease long term.
No, mechanistic speculation there, Paul. Cardiovascular health long term. Show me a study which informs us on that question. There isn't one. Sorry about that.
And at the end of the video, we talked about some of the hidden dangers of a ketogenic diet.
No, you didn't. You put up more propaganda and more smoke and mirrors and more fearmongering against a completely appropriate species-specific approach to nutrition if undertaken appropriately. That's all you did. You have not done any service to humanity in this video, Paul. You have done yet more misanthropic noise-making. Absolutely disgraceful. Minus 1 million points.
Which can actually increase.
And in terms of if you're sitting in my class taking critical research analysis, you will be back next semester to repeat the course, Paul, because you failed in the most destitute fashion possible. Stop talking about research, Paul. You have no business here. You are out of your depth. You do not know how to analyze a paper. Okay? Stop it.
Advanced glycation end products, which is what we were worried about in the first place with all of this. So this is all really important discussion. I respect.
Yes, it is an important discussion, but it's one that should be left to the adults, Paul, the actual scientists, the people that actually understand this stuff. And that's not you. All you've done is misguide your audience. Completely. Incredible.
All of these folks in the ketogenic community, most of them are really good friends of mine, and I love these discussions, and I hope that they further our collective understanding.
Well, I think if people want to further their understanding, what they need to do is sit through this video that I've put together today, Paul, that points to your charlatanism and your complete lack of competence to speak on human nutrition. And my repeated plea to you, Paul, once again, to knock it on the head, son. Stop it. Stop it today. You are out of your depth. Go and be a psychiatrist. That is your training. Go and do that. Well, you must be having a real ball with me too as a psychiatrist, Paul. I bet you are.
So that we can all
Is this guy for real or is that an act?
become healthier as a result.
No. Another speculation. False. All right, what an absolute load of nonsense. That's the end of Paul's video. Nothing to commend it whatsoever. Absolute garbage, rubbish, nonsense from start to finish, misanthropic, dangerous disinformation. You really ought to be locked up, Paul, frankly. You really ought to be locked up. Right, okay. See you next time. Let's enjoy some Vivaldi. 2, 3, 4.